coming through the airport. As a retired vet, I always stop at the VSO, so I appreciate it.
Thank you.
She was elected as the first African-American woman district governor for Toastmasters International in the state of Virginia, and the first African-American woman international director elected to the state of Virginia, to serve the state of Virginia's South through a portion of Texas. She is a mother of 2 sons, and she is also the chairman of her outreach ministry at her church. Let's introduce you, thank you, Pat Hunter-Jordan. Next, we have Dr. Greg Smithers. Dr. Smithers is a professor of American history, an eminent scholar at Virginia Commonwealth University, and a British Academy School professor at the University of Hull in England. His research focuses on Cherokee and Southeastern Indigenous history, as well as gender, sexuality, racial, and environmental history. His latest book is Reclaiming Two Spirits: Sexuality, Spiritual, Renewal, and Sovereignty in Native America. Thank you, Dr. Greg Smithers. And last but not least, we have Eden Hyman. She is the legal director of the ACLU of Virginia, the statewide affiliate of the National ACLU, which is a nonprofit organization with approximately 2 million members nationwide, over 30,000 members in Virginia. She has authored several publications and served on the Virginia State Bar Special Committee on Lawyer Referrals. Prior to joining the ACLU of Virginia in 2018, Eden served as a staff attorney, senior supervising attorney, and managing attorney for the Southern Poverty Law Center in New Orleans, Louisiana, and as an attorney for the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana. She received her law degree from Loyola University, her master's degree in social work from Tulane University, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Florida. She currently lives in Richmond with her husband, 11-month-old daughter, and 3 rescue dogs. Ladies and gentlemen, Eden. So before we begin, I would like to give each panelist an opportunity to open the floor and set the stage for the conversation. So we'll start with Dr. Smithers.
No, I would. Let me turn my sound off.
It is sensitive here.
Can you hear me?
Awesome.
Hey, I didn't know you were going to throw me under the bus there.
I'm not driving it.
Let me pull up my notes here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to be here. It's lovely to see so many concerned members of the public, as we should be. There are big issues that we should be concerned about at the moment. And this is one of them. Thinking about this yesterday afternoon, I was mind cast back to a class that I started teaching about 15 years ago now, that deals with the intellectual history of North America. And thinking back on that class and the responses that students often have to that class is the sort of central point, the central memory that came up to me in thinking back on that was, well, why does this keep happening? There are these cycles of fear and hate and anxiety and targeting of particular groups. Students feel both, in the words of one of them not that long ago, ripped off that they didn't hear about this sooner in life, and also really angry that this keeps happening. Why is it that we don't seem to learn anything from the past? And so, sort of sitting with my dog, who, as I mentioned, one of my panelists likes to come to my feet straight away when I call her, I was thinking about some of these moments and what they have in common with the current moment. And so I began in the 16th century. Right? I'm a historian, so I'm that guy you don't invite to the party because I bring up all these really antiquated ideas and events. And 1560s, right? Spanish colonialism, particularly Spanish priests, were burning Mayan documents in the 1560s, because those sacred texts contained information that was contrary to Catholic doctrine and ideas in the 16th century. And in particular, in addition to targeting those texts, as I talk about in my most recent book, they were targeting people we know today as two-spirited. The knowledge keepers within many of these communities. They were targeting not only with silencing, but they were targeting with genocidal levels of violence. So this was the first example that came back to mind, talking to students about this. The second was from the 17th century, in the 1630s and 40s, when in New England there was a whole slew of books that were published and banned. The first of which was Thomas Morton's The New English Canaan. Why was the book banned? Well, it contained information about the ulterior motives of some of the New England founders and their hypocrisies that they brought with them to the New World. Well, then I jumped ahead again a century into the 17th and 18th centuries, when there are attacks on Cherokee people throughout the Southeast. First during the Anglo-Cherokee War in 1759 through 61, and then during the Revolutionary War. Towns and townhouses were destroyed, razed to the ground, and documents were burned. And in fact, our National Library, the Library of Congress, contains within it, in fact, its first documents were stolen from Cherokee townhouses during the Revolutionary War. Jump ahead again into the 20th century, in the 1920s, and we have this immense anxiety about evolution and the teaching of evolution in classrooms. My mind sort of flickered into the more recent period, and not that long ago, here in Chesterfield, when Rainbow Rowell's book attracted a lot of attention. Some of you in the room might remember this. Eleanor Park, a 2013 book, was accused by Senator Amanda Chase of being pornographic. Vile, vile, nasty language, she said. God, that sounds familiar. Nasty. And then, to the very recent, our current time, in fact, the governor has until April 11th, and some of the other panelists may talk about this, SB 656, Siobhan Donovan, who's introduced a bill about sexually explicit content, which looks an awful lot like Florida's Don't Say Gay law that recently passed. And so I'm going through all of these, flipping through the centuries here, and I'm like, what does all of this have in common? And I'm an Indigenous historian, and the thing that struck me again and again and again, within their own particular context, is the anxieties and fears that large segments of white people have. As one Native elder recently told me, white people keep taking our stuff and then trying to kill us. And that seems to be a recurring theme over and over and over again throughout the century. And there are different reasons for that within their particular historical context, which I'd be happy to address. But this seems to be one of those moments then that we're in right now. This great fear of sharing power and knowledge and the distribution, the fair distribution of wealth and social justice measures seems to be of incredible concern, and people are lashing out in this particular prejudicial way.
Thank you, Dr. Smithers. That's a great opening. That gives a great segue for Eden to give us her thoughts on the opening thoughts. So it should just be opening thoughts on the subject of the censorship or the divisive concept.
I thought I was going to be last. I thought you were going to work your way this time.
I am. So just coming to you.
That's a hard act to follow over there. I have a few thoughts I wanted to kind of just start opening with, which I think to put all of this into context. Approaching this as a lawyer, not as an academic. So first I want to say, Virginia is in a very unique spot. I moved here about 4 years ago from Louisiana, and I think one of the things that surprised me initially about Virginia was how politically charged it is, probably more so than any other place I've lived in my life. And I think the reason why, for whatever reason, is that Virginia is right now kind of ground zero for a lot of the culture wars happening across the country. And I think the idea is that the narrative that wins in Virginia can win the narrative for the country, right? We are the bellwether, if you will, for the rest of the nation. And that's a lot of power to have in one state, right? And so that also puts a lot of importance on the work that we do here to make sure that if there are strategies and things that happen here, we try to to nip them in the bud before they replicate and spread throughout the country in a way that causes more serious damage beyond just in our state. So that's one issue I want to kind of quickly flag is really where Virginia is and the role of Virginia in this piece. The second thing I want to talk about is the law on these issues. They are constantly evolving. I think it's nice to think about. We have a lot of people who will write to us for intakes at the ACLU and they'll say, this is happening and it violates my constitutional rights. I'm like, oh, I wish everything was as clear cut as that. It's usually not. The law, even on book banning, is very unclear. The last major ruling on book banning by the U.S. Supreme Court was back in the 80s, and it was what's called a plurality opinion, meaning there was no majority opinion on it. They had to have several justices kind of concurred with each other to come up with a finding on it, but it is not considered a majority opinion. So as of right now, the law on this stuff is really murky, and what that opinion came to the conclusion with is that you can't ban things for content, right? Like it can't be because the school dislikes the content of it, but they can ban it if they feel like it's inappropriate for the audience, right? Which is where we get into some of these discussions about, oh, well, what about sexually explicit material? Well, if you take something out of context in the book within which it's in, very often you might read something in a Toni Morrison book or a Kurt Vonnegut book and say, oh, well, this is horrible, because it's taken out of context. It's not part of the larger historical piece, the literary piece of that novel and that work. And so it's a real concern to see that, and it's really concerning because the law is not, it's not going to protect a lot of this unless we do things to make it so. So, for example, I think that's where the role of our lawmakers in the state is so important. As most of y'all know, our federal judiciary, our Supreme Court, is going more and more conservative, which means they may be less and less likely to protect certain issues involving some of these matters as it goes up. Some of our district and appellate court benches are also conservative. And so as we kind of look at each General Assembly session, the laws that come up, we need to be very, very vigilant and make sure that we stay on top of our lawmakers to ensure that we are not passing laws that really hold us back and potentially hurt these issues. And the last thing I wanted to quickly say, and I'm sure we'll get into this, is I do think folks, that we are losing the narrative on this. And I mentioned this earlier to a few folks. For whatever reason, like the concept of parent rights and parent choice has been co-opted by the other side here. And so it's really hard to argue about the merits of reading literature when someone else is going, but I'm a parent and I have rights. And of course a parent has rights, right? Like that feels like we're all shouting into the wind together. And as a parent, I have rights. I have a right that I want my child to be exposed to these works of literature, right? Or these other concepts. But like why did we lose that narrative? I think that's something that we need to talk about and get on top of so that we're not playing the defensive game, which I think, we have been on these issues for so long.
Thank you, Ms. Pat Hunter-Jordan, your opening thoughts on censorship and the divisive concepts.
Thank you so much for having me. Thinking about both the statements offered here, we see so much of this in our work. Our work is social justice. Our work is environmental justice. Our work revolves around criminal justice. And the intersection of all of that, we have begun to see, is fear. And we look at that and find that that's the basis of most things that we see. The people in power are afraid of losing their power, simply to be fair to others. And when we confront this, we hear, well, Christians would not love transgender You know, this is just not Christian. And then we have to go back and say to them, if you truly read your Bible, then you would understand that God said he loves all people and he made no mistakes. And getting that point across to them is difficult because they want to take their personal stand no matter what truth is. And so we know that that comes out of fear. Because when you can stand before a school board and say that our children are getting beat up in the bathroom by transgender kids, but if you look at the statistics, transgender kids are the ones being targeted by the other kids. But they don't want to hear truth. And so lots of times, just telling the truth doesn't help. We ask to sit down. Let's have a conversation. Let's share. They don't want to do that with us because the talking points that they've been indoctrinated to present would then be null and void. And so we fight that, the banning of the books. We actually read one of the books. They wanted banned to them, to our board, to say, what is so wrong? You believe in the Bible, and everything that's in the Bible is worse than what's in this book. So tell me what is wrong here. The only thing in this book that you want banned is because it has a picture of a sword on it. And you're saying that is too violent for your 5-year-old to see. And pardon me for my allergies are killing me. But we fight those concepts and those things. And as Eden says, we cannot allow them to take over the narrative. Because, yeah, your kid has a right, just as mine does. And so I have a right to allow my child to read those books that you want banned. So we don't ban them from the library. We leave them in the library. When your child brings a book home that you don't like, you send it back to the library. You know, there's simple results and things that we can do for this if we are talking to people who want to be reasonable. And so those are the things that we are continually struggling with, and the places that we have to go to fight this battle that we see on a daily basis.
Thank you, Ms. Hunter Jordan. Dr. LaToya.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm trying to figure out where I want to jump in here. I think I'm going to go to the term divisive concepts, because that term, to me, you know, to be wielded so freely by a state leader, I'm going to ask everybody in the room to, at this very moment, if you have a child, if you have a grandchild, if you have a niece or a nephew, I want you to think, what is the one thing that that child needs that you would like for your child to get when they walk into a classroom, whether it's K through 12 or whether it's a higher education classroom. Think in your mind, what is the one thing that you need your child to be provided when they go into a school? Everybody has a thing or two or three. But the next thing I want you to think about is, what if that one thing that your kid needs, your governor calls it a divisive concept? As a black woman who's 48 years old, who has grown tired at 48 of explaining what black people need, explaining what I need, talking about what I did not get, but for the great teachers that I had growing up in South County, predominantly, Black teachers. Black students need race, identity, culture intertwined in their educational experience. And for our governor and our leaders and our voters to decide that the one thing that a Black child needs is divisive, it's not surprising, it's historic, it's traditional. They have never, the powers that be have never put any kind of real reform in place for African American students. I have researched it. I've gone down the list of reforms, the various acts and laws that have been put in place, but none of them have been put in place to directly address African American students. We have laws that have been, and reforms that have been put in place for Native Americans. We have laws that have been put in place for Jewish Americans. And when we think about it, I think it was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg who said, anywhere decisions are being made, women need to be at the table. And in the same respect, anywhere education decisions are being made where African Americans are being concerned, African Americans need to be at the table. And it's the same with, various ethnicities and different types of groups that have been disenfranchised and discriminated against. In terms of these divisive concepts, it's the narrative, it's not new. What it is it's racism. It's blatant racism. And we can tiptoe around this issue of we don't want our children to feel like this burden is theirs. We don't want our children to be aggressively attacked. Black children have been aggressively excluded since the beginning of time. I mean, I could write my own book about the things that happened to me. And I'm going to recall one simple instance. I'm raising 3 sons. I've raised 2 of them, 24, 23. I've got a 14-year-old. My 14-year-old has had maybe 1 Black teacher in his whole life. In 2021, over 70% of the teachers in public schools in America are white and female. 7% are Black. How do we get more Black people in education? 1, we hire them. 2, we pay them. Education is not a field that pays. And then in counties like Chesterfield, sort of upper echelon types of counties, we need to hire and recruit more African American teachers. It is important, research proves it, it is important for a Black child to walk into school and see someone who looks like them. Whether it's principal, whether it's teacher, whether it's aide, it's important. So I want to think in terms of identity development. Coming out of a period of 400 years of slavery, chains and slavery, and I won't get into all the specifics of what happened to Black people in slavery. We know the story. We know that narrative. That's the narrative they don't want us to talk about. That's the truth they don't want to tell. And we have got to stop lying to our kids. We got to stop lying to Black kids. We got to stop lying to white kids. We have to stop lying to all kids, because it is an utter disgrace for a child to leave K through 12, get to college, and for the first time ever, be confronted with race, be able to actually talk about it. It's a disgrace for African American students to have to get to college and find out a little bit more about themselves. I have been teaching since 1998 as a military spouse all over this nation. The narrative is the same. The only place the narrative has not been the same is when I'm teaching at an HBCU. And I believe it was the late Julian Bond, who was an amazing attorney, lawmaker, activist. He said for a Black child to do 12 years of school and come out with 6 years of education, that's the worst possible lynching. I'm seeing the worst possible lynching in college when students get there and they don't know their history. They don't know who they are. So for African American students, getting to an HBCU, getting to a college classroom, that's too late. And I love to call on my elders, because we all know that that's how we got here. We got here riding on the backs of other people who were smart enough and who were brave enough a lot of the time in America, because I don't think there's been a single day where I woke up where I didn't have to think about it. So what privilege is that for the rest of the world, the rest of the white world, to be able to get up every day and maybe just think about poverty, maybe just think about how I'm going to eat. But for a black person to get up every day and think about all the complexities of life, and on top of that, that be confounded by color, by race. So this is a very real conversation that we need to have, because what they are fighting, I've penned 3 books titled 28 Days of Poetry Celebrating Black History. It's a 3-volume collection. The first one was published back in, I believe, 2006. Maybe I might be wrong on the year. But the idea of creating those books was to be able to go into public schools, not just for little black girls and boys, but for everybody. And when I have gone into those schools for the last 15, 20 years, I've been welcomed by black teachers, white teachers, Asian teachers. We lived in Korea for 2 years. I took it there. When I'm in those schools, young people are eager to learn, no matter what color they are. They are eager to hear the truth. Some of these kids that are coming up are brighter than their parents know and realize. Truth be told, they have a little bit more sense than the adults who are making the rules. But you know, it is very important that we are included, that we're including everyone. So diversity, equity, inclusion, you know, it lumps in all groups, but my advocacy is still for the group of the African Americans. And we know what the black community looks like. I'm not a person who shies away from what black community looks like, what's happening in black community with the addictions. We can look at the 80s when crack ravaged black communities. We look at that. This is a real story that we need to be talking about. In the 80s, crack ravaged black communities. And in the last decade, crystal meth has ravaged white communities. And I remember driving down through my county in Southampton and seeing all these get help if you have a crystal meth addiction. And we know why we see them, just like the signs that are out here saying Black Lives Matter, because finally an addiction is killing rich white kids. Where was that help? I'm going to say it because black people are always the last to get help. If something's going down in the community, we are suffering it the worst. So this target, these divisive concepts, it's really about us. It's really about race. Members of the LGBTQIA community are in there, but who will suffer the most if these leaders and this platform is able to pass? It's going to be the African American. And I'll stop right there for a moment.
I'm so sorry that you have to follow I'm sorry.
I must switch. I'm so happy that I can be last. Where is the switch? On the switch. No, it works.
There you go.
There we go. Whoa. I'm Brian Manning. I'm the director of a public library, but I'm here as the chair currently of the Virginia Library Association Intellectual Freedom Committee. So first, let me speak generally about libraries. In 1939, the American Library Association came out with its Library Bill of Rights. 1939, you understand the history, I hope, of how decisive and how destructive many cultures were in destroying ideas or silencing voices of minorities as well as coming under attack. So 1939. Last year, the American Library Association also came out with its statement on diversity and the right of people to have access to different opinions, and I can share those statements with you. I had to think about what I wanted to say in this conversation, and what came to me was lines from a Mary Chapin Carpenter song. Libraries want something in their collection that makes you cry until you can laugh. They want something in the collection that can make you laugh until you cry. We want something that will inspire you to take action, and something that will make you zone out and shut down and let the world pass you by for a while. Above all else, we want to have information in some resource either we can provide to you or we can get to you that helps you prove a point, disapproves a point that you want, approve of taking action, show your disapproval, whatever inspired you to do or act or think. I worked for someone who made the comment, there should be no penalty in life for thinking. And so the pendulum in that situation swings both ways. And I'm not going to apologize for either side. In my own personal life, I can march, I can petition, I can vote, I can take action. But as a library, I want to provide a balanced collection that answers everything. And you can agree with it, disagree with it. Someone said check it out, don't check it out. I don't want anything in a collection that is confrontational. But controversial as in controverse, creating an open discussion and a debate and a give and take so we can realize which way we want to go, you betcha. Provocative as in provoking you to think, to take action, that's what I want you to do. Where those pieces go in a library, whether it's in nonfiction, political opinion, science, or fiction, and a lot of what I've heard in the last several years is pure fiction, and yet it's accepted as fact. And I want to provide, the library wants to provide you relevant, reliable information on those topics. And it is, so long as it's an open debate, there's information on both sides. And I will put both opportunities in your hand, and you can decide which way you want to go. Now, because this relates to schools, I would be not well liked if I did not speak that my wife inspired me, encouraged me to go into libraries. And she was a youth services librarian. And for part of her career, she was with the public library as a children's librarian. She ended her career before she retired with a community college. In between, she worked as a school librarian at an elementary school. And let me tell you that all the principles that I just addressed as to how a library should have the information someone wants applies to school libraries, plus the school librarians I've known work themselves to death. The comment, other duties as assigned, takes on a whole new meaning with all the things that my wife had to do as a school librarian. And she had to fight for time for the children to come to the school library. Oh, they can only come after they arrive on the bus before school starts, or they have to come after school's over, but they got to make the bus. When you have classes in your library, teach them how to use the library, but we're not going to give them a chance to come. So you want a school librarian and the school library to do all I said with relation to the student body at that school. But the school library shouldn't, and I would not support shying away from that other side of the conversation. If all we're going to have is one side of the conversation, that's not a library. It needs to be both sides so people can go back and forth and learn from each other and develop opinions. That's it.
Thank you. Listening to all of you in your opening statements, I heard a common theme regarding fear, right? That some of the ideas behind book banning or parental choice or the disinformation is all stems from a level of fear that the community is feeling. The fear that we're taking their choices away. That's why they're speaking parental choice. They're trying to exercise their freedom of speech, but someone would say, is that hate speech? Can we allow hate speech? So, from your perspective in the areas that you're working in, your opinion on how do we combat the fear? And that's not an easy question to answer, but that is a common problem that we have, right? That is the linchpin for what is driving these conversations, because at these school board meetings, at the General Assembly, are passionate parents who truly believe that what they're saying is the right thing to do. Like they truly believe that their child is going to come home crying because the literature made them feel bad, right? And the conversation is not being had, to Latorio's point, about how does that black child feel? That when you start the conversation in class, you start telling my child that their history begins with slavery. And we know that's not true. Right? So now the parents have to become teachers. Now we have to educate our children ourselves, as opposed to letting the public institution that we're trusting and paying for to do so is failing. But if we can combat the fear aspect, so just a little bit of your thoughts, please, whoever would like to go first, on how do we combat the
from schools, the whole point of teaching, going back to my wife, every year or so there'd be a new acronym and a new theme of how they were going to educate the children. But in the most recent years, it's always come down to critical thinking, that we aren't supposed to teach by rote, memorize this, and that's the answer, and go with it. They're supposed to be able to look at concepts from the early age all the way, certainly through high school. And by the way, I hated being a team player in group projects. But working together to come up with the final solution requires us to have the open conversation back and forth. So yes, people are going to get upset about different things. But I can't remember which of this panel mentioned. Certain groups are cherry picking this page or this word or this book, and from a library perspective, of an intellectual freedom perspective, you have to look at the whole body. Now, does that mean everything belongs in the library? No, because some stuff is crap. But you want to buy quality or provide quality information that has that whole story, the whole body of the work needs to start that conversation. And I'm sorry, parents have to talk to their children. Parents have to have this conversation and not silence the conversation because it makes you feel bad or makes you feel icky. I do not have children. I know that if I had children, they would have been perfect. They would have put all of your children to shame. But the thing is, you need to occasionally talk to your children. What did you learn? And here, this is not speaking of social society or in general, but we've lost a lot of that opportunity of sitting down with the dinner table. What did you learn today? What would you talk about? I can't help it. How you get to meet your children, interact. I can't get my nephews to stop texting me when they're just 2 feet away from me. So, but we have to have that conversation, even if it does upset us somewhat. Sorry.
Anyone else?
I'll add to that. For me, we dispel fear early on in life. If we wait, it becomes more difficult. And so I've talked to a lot of our white allies and said, yeah, you're allies now. But when you have your outings with your kids, how many black children are going with you? When you have your big dances, and one of the things that I brought up, and a couple of them I think got upset with me, but you have your big dance because it's COVID and the school can't have a dance. So you rent out your country club and you had your dance. How many people of color, students of color, did you invite to be there? And so you got to teach your kids when they start young that this is the world that we live in. It is not a separate world where you have all your white friends and you do all of these things, but you say I'm an ally. And I believe, and I'm going to teach my kids that they should be fair. But we teach through demonstrating what we're saying. So we can say all we want, that we should be fair. But until we show them through every aspect of our life, and we who are Christians, we are the biggest hypocrites at that. I'm a Christian. I can say that. Because at 11 o'clock, you're at your white church, I'm at my black church. Okay? So until we start, we put those barriers down, then that fear is going to remain there. And we've got to become intentional. That's our buzzword for the year. We've got to become intentional about these things. So everything I do, I've got to sit there and say, okay, am I including these people? And so I specifically said to our allies, this is not a trip for Black people. It's a trip for all of us so that you too can begin to understand. Even if your kid doesn't, you as a parent need to go with them. So the explanation is going to be there so that you can answer the questions. And so that's a lot of where I think we can begin to attack this fear issue. And as long as we say it doesn't belong in schools, we can't talk about race, we can't do this, then the cause is lost. We're just going to keep on repeating same things we've done as we continually tell Hanover County. We have to take you to court to desegregate. We have to take you to court to change school names. We got to take you to court for transgender. When are you going to stop wasting money? And just keep the right thing. So that's when fear controls. And we've got to start that and start being bold and let people know we're no longer going to take this. We're not going to just sit back and let things be as things have been.
Thank you.
I'm going to piggyback off of that really quick because I get the sense we're probably preaching to the choir here. I think the vast majority of folks in this room are probably pretty like-minded in terms of wanting the exposure of information. But when I think about like the arguments in fear, I think about even fear among the community in which we are. So when people say, oh, we can't let schools teach critical race theory, the average person on our side says, they don't teach critical race theory in elementary school. That's the argument back, right? Or they don't teach critical race theory in high school. What about, what's wrong with critical race theory? I want my child to know what redlining is. I want my child to understand these experiences. If they don't, they're getting an incomplete education, right? So we're making the wrong arguments. And I think so fear isn't on both, I mean, it's on both sides. It's not just on the side of folks who are trying to shut down the discussion. It's also on the side of people who are trying to rebut the discussion, right? By trying to like deflect and say, oh, don't worry, you don't get taught critical race theory until you're in college or law school. Like, well, no, you know what? We should be teaching critical race. Do you know what critical race theory is? And B, like, why is that wrong? I mean, I laughed at watching Ted Cruz read Anti-Racist Baby. I read it to my daughter every night, and I still don't understand what's wrong with the book. I'm like, what is, I read it again last night to be like, I am at a loss. There's nothing in that book to me that is controversial or should be controversial, right? That these are discussions we should be having with every child, starting from when they are an infant. Well, you have like posters of it, it's now the #1 trending book on Amazon, which is, but I mean, I think we need, because we are all like-minded, and we're not here to, we're not changing the girl's mind. You all agree probably with the general concept that we're speaking about. But I do think the way, folks are responding to these arguments is probably helping to contribute to that culture of fear. So as opposed to saying, no, don't worry, critical race theory isn't being taught in school, like you shouldn't worry about that. I think we really need to dig down and say, you know what? It should be taught from a very early age. Like the idea of exposing a child to the systems and structures of our country and how they are failing people of color, especially Black people, is something that needs to be taught as early as possible.
That's right.
Yes, ma'am.
So that leads into the next question about the inherently divisive concepts, right? So our governor has published executive orders where EO 1 and 2 that calls out specifically that we will not address inherently divisive concepts. And he gives some examples, poor examples, because we all know Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln did not have that conversation. So we need to check with his history teacher's work. But in there, he's explaining examples of things that he views that could be considered inherently divisive. And so to Dr. Latorio, if you don't mind expanding a little bit about how do we know it's not divisive, right? So instead of just defining it for what it is, analogies, pictures. We need to come up with another way to take the narrative back that this is not divisive, it's informative, right? This is not divisive, this is education. This is not divisive, this is the sake of our children, the future of our Commonwealth. For those of us here, how would you approach the conversation of breaking down the barriers to this divisive concept that he's concerned so much about?
I'm going to lean back into the last question just a little bit, because it's all, we use the word fear, but for me it's not fear, it's indoctrination. It's indoctrination. If we go back to the early Jim Crow civil rights movement, all of those people had been indoctrinated. Okay, you've had all these years of slavery, and you've been taught, most white people had been taught that black men were lazy, you couldn't have your daughters and your children around them. So you have that indoctrination, and then you don't want your child to mix and mingle with that. That's kind of what we're seeing today, and that's what the fear is. It's the same fear that perhaps this group is going to rise up. And I don't know what goes through a white racist mind. I mean, I have not written that poem yet. A friend of mine has written that poem. He likes to do persona poems where he pretends he's someone else. I cannot write that poem yet, but we have to definitely, have the conversation about what race is in this country. It's been the elephant in the room, and I'm just simple. We call a spade a spade. Racism is not just the KKK.
That's right.
Racism, let's go back to how we ended up with the textbooks that we had. Exactly. The South won, the South lost. The South lost. They won. The South lost, and as a trade-off, we get the daughters of the Confederacy writing our textbooks. Okay, now let's fast forward to the question that you had. Nobody wants, in terms of indoctrination, it's not fear, it's indoctrination, okay? I was raised by my grandparents, okay, who did not graduate from high school, okay? They did the best that they could. And might I add, they did an amazing job. But not everything they told me was true. It's that simple. Not everything that our forefathers taught us, provided for us, the systems that they put in place, not every system that we have in America was designed with the freedom and liberty and justice for all. That's where we have to get to. We have to call our founding fathers what they were. We are suddenly, for example, I'm a graduate of UVA, and I love UVA with all my heart. I really do. I could live on that campus. I love UVA with all of my heart. I spent 4 years there. That place changed my life for the better. And it was not the education that I received in books. It was the diversity that was there. It was the ability for people to come together and freely think and have this conversation for the first time about race and diversity. We need to bottle what is happening on college campuses and let that permeate through K through 12 in appropriate ways. I felt like we were headed toward that direction. Young lady down here has talked about white allies, okay? Everybody knows black people wouldn't be free without white allies. Freedom fighters, freedom riders, people who worked on the Underground Railroad. That Underground Railroad still exists. And I want to thank every white person in the room, because if you are here, you're an ally. If you are here, you are a freedom fighter. This is what has to permeate. It's not our children or the people in the room that we're worried about. It's how do we reach these other people. Frederick Douglass had a quote that went something like this: it's easier to raise strong kids than to repair broken men. This challenge that we face today is We have a task on how we're going to deal with the nation's kids. K through 12, that's our responsibility. I just told you, my grandparents did not have a high school diploma. They trusted that my education system was doing the best it could to educate me. And I dare say Southampton County Public Schools did a great job because I went to 3 of the best universities in Virginia. That's what we're facing. How do we deal with the kids? How do we deal with these grown-ups? Now, I don't know if Frederick Douglass would say, forget the grown-ups, and let's deal with the kids, and that's why we're here. But when you have parents who are at school board meetings yelling and irate and really setting an example that is unbecoming to their own children, I don't know how to combat that. In terms of our governor, and I know this is being streamed live, he is either ignorant or being ill-advised. How do you make it this far? You know, there's some part of me that thinks, like our last president, that he's playing with his own constituents. And that's a terrible thing, because I don't like for this to get lost in the discussion. I like to tell people that, you know, I know you hear a lot about African Americans and LGBTQI people, and we always talk about what we need and what we want, but there is a group that also does not get support. That's the white poor group. The white, poor, uneducated group. And if we can get to that group, to let them know that their cause is our cause, and our cause is their cause, and that they cannot allow politicians to use them, to take advantage of them. And that's education, that's literacy, that's, you know, we've got to find a way to reach that group. And it's talking, it's in our neighborhood. And I know we go to our own little spaces, and we kind of don't want to deal with these people because, as I said before, I'm black and tired. But if you keep inviting me to these events, I'll keep showing up. Because that is how I was raised. Black people have had to have conversations with their children. You know, if Ruby Bridges, I think there was a meme going around, if Ruby Bridges was old enough to experience it, everybody else is old enough to learn about it. And I, you know, from the time I grew up, I can remember my grandparents teaching me, you gotta do this, you have to do this as a black person. It's very real when black parents teach students like, or people like Ketanji Brown Jackson, like, what's the big deal with her, okay? We're not gonna waste time trying to help people understand what the big deal is, because good, conscious people know what the big deal is. Good, conscious people know what it's been like, if you've been paying attention, if you've read any good books, if they've been around in your child's school, if they've had any black teachers. They know what the big deal is. And not only do they know what the big deal is, they want to know. So that group that I mentioned, they don't want to know. It's not fear, it's indoctrination. No one, I mean, the biggest thing with those statues was, we removed those statues and our forefathers, that history is gone. It means that we have to admit that we lost. This was a fight for the nation. The Civil War was a war about fighting for the nation. Freedom and justice for all. That's what we're up against right now. This is a war for the nation. Do we want the numbers of our unlearned public to grow? Or do we want to start teaching? So it sounds like we not only have K through 12 to combat, but we have higher ed to combat. We have vocational education to combat. You know, I talk this talk all the time. I'm not afraid to talk race talk. You cannot be afraid to talk race talk. Because what I know at the end of the day is nobody can tell me the experiences that I have had. I could keep you up all night telling you how some white person tried to disenfranchise me. 4th grade, white woman walks into my classroom. She asked my teacher, Miss Tabor, who I still remember, a black female teacher, she says, I'm not going to call the person's name, but she says, I need this student. My black teacher said, okay, what do you need her for? My black teacher knew what she needed her for, okay? Because this is the gifted coordinator for the county. She walks We need white people to educate other white people. That's the bottom line.
That's right.
Okay? Because we're going to keep doing this all day long. Okay? I'm tired of arguing. People are tired of arguing. But we need white people to go into those communities and pockets of indoctrination and hate and racism. It's hard work. You know, every semester at BSU, I ask the students in my classroom, by show of hands, raise your hand if you feel like you represent your race. You're responsible for your race. Around the new millennium, I started to see black students not raise their hand. And I'm like, how dare you? But they don't know. They haven't been educated. They don't know their history. So it's the same thing with white people and other people. They don't know. And that's the big question. How do we get them to know? How do we teach them? They should have been invited here today. They should have been invited here today. Whether they came or not, they should have accepted an invitation. So how do we get them to accept an invitation, Melody? That's the conversation we've got to get ourselves past. And I want to go back to, I talked about Governor Youngkin, and I've been praying. I remember when President Trump took office. I was teaching in Northern Virginia at Northern Virginia Community College, and many other students cried the day that Hillary Clinton lost. And I remember my first election when I voted in high school, and they cried. I had Trump supporters in my classroom, but the students who voted for Hillary, they cried. And I'm like, guys, this is just one election. You got to get back in there and, keep voting, keep reading, keep studying. But I was praying that I was praying that President Trump would somehow be a great president. I really did, because I'm like, we have him now. Maybe he'll surround himself by great people, and this state will be good. We all know how that went. I'm praying the same prayer for Youngkin. I'm waiting for him to say, okay, I played a joke on you guys. Just need to get your votes. It's not going to happen. And so we have got to spend the next 3 years reaching Youngkin voters. So for all the mediators in the room, all the peacemakers in the room, all the peacemakers out there, that's what has to happen. Maybe a child shall lead them. I don't know. Maybe we need to start a child coalition like they did when King was marching back in the 50s and the 60s. There were children who actually marched. Maybe that's what we need to do. But something has to be done so that we can reach the people on the other side.
So that's thank you, Dr. Zora. So that's to wrap up that first segment. That's what we're hearing is the indoctrination. The fear comes from the indoctrination, right? We're hearing that we want parental choice in the libraries. That means all books should be in the libraries, so that you do have a choice. Because if there's only one kind, that's not a choice. We understand that we got to continue to fight, and we have everyone in the room to fight. So whether we're preaching to the choir or not, what the onus is on the people in the room is to continue the work, continue the conversations.
And just real quick,
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Smith.
in there, the indoctrination is right, but the issue with indoctrination is it naturalizes prejudice and prejudicial attitudes and behaviors. And so that's, in terms of structural change, which is what we need to denaturalize those things that cause the prejudice, prejudicial thoughts and actions, legislation, and that, in part, begins with restructuring our educational curriculum.
That's what they're fighting.
The continued fight for, I'm sorry, this guy, I'm trying to get at the right spot. The continued fight at the school board, so those of you who are not aware, there's a planned mission to put a certain type of voice on school boards in Virginia, right? There's a concerted effort, organized concerted effort, well-funded concerted effort to put certain voices on the school board because they understand that the way to continue the indoctrination, the prejudicial treatment, and the discrimination, and the ignorance is to control what the children learn, right? So what does that mean for those of you in the room? Whether you're a parent or not, come to a school board meeting. Sign sign up to speak, submit a comment, support our teachers, support our principals, support our children, because just because you do not have children in the school does not mean that what happens in those schools does not affect you. What we don't want is children graduating and becoming the nuisance or the juvenile delinquent that worries you in your neighborhood, right? So then the education does matter. That's where your tax dollars are going. So whether you have children in the system or not, whether you have a teacher that you want to support or not, we still need your voices. And attending things like this is awesome, but the work starts after you walk out the door. The work continues after you walk out the door. When you're home, when you're in those circles that Ms. Jordan just mentioned about, when you're in those meetings or in that park playing with your children, have the conversation. As awkward as it may seem to try to have that conversation, imagine a black person trying to have that conversation for you. It's just as awkward. More so. So I want to thank this first group of panelists for joining us for that first half. If you thought that was something, we've got some fire for you in the next part of the panel, where we're going to be talking about CRT, the LGBTQIA issues facing our students in schools, and this teacher tip line that our governor would like to continue to use. So at that moment, I'm going to give everyone a 10-minute break so that we can reset. I want to thank my panelists for joining us. In the back, I'd like to talk to some of you, so if you guys don't mind just leaving immediately, so you can go get an interview done, I'd appreciate that. Thank you. We'll take a break for about 10 minutes.